A pleasure to meet all at last. And today, in terms of HJN franchises that we have to talk about, for this instance, I would like to take a bit of a look at something different. Hellboy was something that we covered pretty recently, but now I would like to focus a bit more on something called G.I. Joe. Yeah, so if you're familiar with the many years that I've spent with Hasbro, with quite a big product right behind me, you'll know that I have talked about these as well as Transformers as a few mere examples in terms of what Hasbro has to offer. But something that I hadn't talked about very much was G.I. Joe. The term itself, believe it or not, is actually a combination of two generic terms made to create something new out of. And as far back as 1964 was when Hasbro was offering G.I. Joe to the public. And while the toy line itself didn't see very much success at first, there was a lot of commercialization made, especially in the 80s, with G.I. Joe, a real US hero. This, of course, was one of the first to come along, at first in 1983, and much like when the original Transformers, otherwise known as G1 Transformers, came around, G.I. Joe was able to push for Hasbro's success in the toy industry as well as in the cartoon industry. And to that extent, coupled with a lot of familiar voice actors out there, even Chris Latta, yeah, you might remember him in that particular era, they did pull off a good amount of success, generating a pretty good amount of attention to both franchises. And with many other franchises that would also kickstart in the 80s, He-Man, Thundercats, Inhumanoids, Ghostbusters, Terminator, and even the Escape from New York series, which wasn't much of a cartoon, but at least gave us a similar impression of popularity over time, especially with fans of Kurt Russell. G.I. Joe was, of course, among this massive crowd of media that spawned throughout the 80s, especially allowing for the marketplace, and companies like Hasbro, Mattel, even Kenner, which of course became very popular that same decade. A lot of things would happen. There wasn't just a massive marketing push for G.I. Joe action figures and a lot of familiar characters here and there, but while I can't say I'm an expert on this franchise, I have had some exposure over the years. I had seen the original 1987 movie, which came out a year after the Transformers made their own movie, and more importantly, was in their closing year, which was 1987, that same year. But still, getting to know about G.I. Joe and their perspective in comparison to the likes of Transformers, plus many other franchises, which I've paid a lot more better attention to over the years, I can see why people were into this. But even more so, as the years went on, they of course would expand their coverage in the media industry, even going to live action, just like Transformers did. There of course was G.I. Joe Retaliation, for instance, in which that they were able to bring out a lot of new material. And there was also the introduction of various actors. Lots of them would include the likes of Dwayne Johnson, Henry Golding, and who could forget Bruce Willis. Yeah, if you thought that he was popular only because of Die Hard, well, he does try his hand at G.I. Joe for some time, but didn't exactly hit the marks in all ways. Still, the G.I. Joe live action films, with Retaliation and the Rise of Cobra, they actually did pretty good for what they were. There is, believe it or not, going to be a future installment called Ever Vigilant. We of course will be getting more of Dwayne Johnson, Bruce Willis, Henry Golding, and many other actors that were from the other films. And so, DJ Caruso is supposedly going to give us some more insight on this, and more importantly, while there's not exactly much more that we can say about it, a lot of us can come to the agreement that G.I. Joe hasn't exactly trailed off as well, not nearly as Transformers did, because the idea of militarization in the marketing hasn't exactly hit off all too well. I mean, we could talk about how troops in the military haven't been treated very well over the years, especially coming back home after a massive war zone. Yeah. But of course, we don't need to get into that sort of effort. A lot of it becomes controversial. Either way you look at it though, the G.I. Joe franchise, in spite of its devolved state, it at least did a good job at getting the market to where it is today. Without G.I. Joe, there are many pieces of advice to offer to the public, PDAs if you will, PSAs of all sorts. They of course spread their message just as Transformers, Ninja Turtles, Ghostbusters, and even the Rescue Heroes had done so. Lots of television programs were taking on these sorts of safety messages and little things, basically becoming a whole different league of fourth wall breaks. Yeah, if you thought that post-credits scene from Ferris Bueller was something, well, this is an entirely new trend. And while it's not exactly as prevalent today because the last generation and a half has gotten a lot of messages from those old cartoons and stuff, that's what led to a much more safer, smarter, and more abundant nation. And I'm glad that it still holds true today. If we hadn't learned our lessons then, we'd probably be in a state of disarray with repeats in history and much more. So G.I. Joe, even down to Sergeant Slaughter, and all of the other unique characters fighting off against the infamous Cobras, let's just hope that someday they not only make a comeback, but in a pretty cool way. Ever Vigilant, and probably many more. While they haven't exactly been talked about very much, some of us can at least agree the series might need a refresher, or at the very least, a reboot, to give us some bigger insight, as well as a good introduction for newcomers to the franchise. Well, I feel like that closes things off for the moment, and the whole franchise itself, after more than 62 years, it certainly hasn't gotten very good at what it is today, but I'm sure that with more franchises to talk about, we might have much more to say on most fronts. So, I'll see you guys tomorrow with another pick relating to franchises, and of course, let's keep it real here.